Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. It is superb to see so many friends. It's been weeks since the end of our winter session, and I've missed you. It's great to welcome you back to this wonderful institution, which is the only institution in America, chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful, you can still do it as well as ever. This is the beginning of our spring town hall season, and we have such exciting events that are coming up. Next Monday, April 23rd, in collaboration with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which made the promise of equality in the Declaration of Independence a reality. The keynote address will be by Eric Holder, and we have, in addition, America's leading scholars of Reconstruction and the Civil War who will be debating the 14th Amendment, past, present, and future. It's going to be an amazing multi-panel program, and I hope you can join. Then, on May 23rd, we have another blockbuster panel on the legacy of the 17th Amendment. Remember the 17th Amendment, which guaranteed the direct election of senators? Well, some are claiming that it should be repealed. And the late Justice Scalia here in Philadelphia, right before his death, said that the 17th Amendment represented the end of federalism. To debate the contemporary meaning of this amendment, we have a keynote address by George F. Will, who is going to just give a remarkable discussion of the contemporary relevance of this amendment, leading journalists and scholars. It's going to be great. And we continue to spread across the country. On May 3rd at Stanford Law School, we are going to have an amazing program on the future of free speech online with Elliot Schrage of Facebook and representatives from Google and Twitter, moderated by Larry Kramer, and we are going to examine this central question which the country is struggling with: how can we guarantee the revival of public reason online? So it's going to be great. Now, all of these phenomenal programs are only made possible by the engagement and support of our members. How many of you are members of the National Constitution Center? That is beautiful. Thank you so much for your wonderful support, and seeing all of those great hands, and your engagement with us is so meaningful and necessary. Anyone who's not a member, please see Rebecca Bolden in the back. And dear C-SPAN viewers, if you're awake now, it's probably 3 in the morning when you're watching this, you really love the Constitution and the Constitution Center. You too must become members of the National Constitution Center and visit our website, constitutioncenter.org, to become part of this crucial American educational institution. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to introduce 3 of America's greatest historians of the rap star of the moment, Alexander Hamilton. We're so excited to welcome them to celebrate the opening of our phenomenal new exhibit, Hamilton, the Constitutional Clashes That Shaped America, and we're going to have an incredible conversation about Hamilton's constitutional legacy. Jay Cost is a political historian and contributing editor at the Weekly Standard and contributor to National Review, and the author of the new book, The Price of Greatness: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. Carol Berkin is presidential professor, American Colonial and Revolutionary History and Women's History at Baruch College. She is the author of many books, including A Brilliant Solution: Inventing the American Constitution. And Tony Williams is Senior Teaching Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute and author of this great new book, Alexander Hamilton, An American Biography. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Carol Berkin, Jay Cost, and Tony Williams. Wonderful to see you. I told you the introduction would be enthusiastic, and it is. And we are going to jump right in. Jay, you did a great podcast with Nancy Eisenberg on this topic, and we did what we're going to try to do in this panel, which is first articulate what Hamilton's constitutional vision was, and then contrast it with his rivals, Jefferson, Madison, and Adams, and then we'll see how far we get. So why don't you lead us off by summing up what Hamilton's constitutional vision was, and why progressives, as you say in a recent piece, have had an ambivalent relationship with it.
Yeah, well, I think that if I had to use a word to describe Hamilton's constitutional vision or his agenda from the Constitution, it would probably be invigoration. That Hamilton saw, like so many of the founders did, so many of the men who gathered at Philadelphia, recognized a need for some sort of stronger national union. But Hamilton was unique relative to many of them, not all of them, but many of them, in that he saw the potential for a national union facilitating economic commerce and growth and even industrial development, and that ultimately lending itself to greater national security, because the United States, of course, at that time was not separated from the European powers. I mean, you had Great Britain to the west, you had Spain still in Florida, you know, you had the French in the west as well. So the European powers are still very much eyeing the United States of America. So a stronger national economy would be one that would generate the resources necessary for self-defense. And also economic transactions. Hamilton appreciated that commerce between disparate parts of the nation could create a sense of unity among otherwise disparate, you know, former colonists. That, you know, Georgians and New Hampshireites might not know each other, but if they were both engaged in commerce with each other, that it would help bind them together. And so Hamilton's vision of the United States was, I think, more than, for instance, James Madison or John Adams, was really rooted in the transformative power of economics and capitalism.
Great. Very helpful. Carol, you've heard what Jay said. You've talked about Hamilton's nationalism, which he shared with Washington, but you've also argued that Hamilton may not have been all that interested in the details of constitutional structure. Tell us about that.
I think they talked about an energetic government, which I think is what you're describing, that he really wanted to see a government that did something instead of the Articles of Confederation. That, in fact, on the eve of the convention, the year before, they couldn't get a quorum in the Confederation Congress. Nobody even bothered to go anymore. So I think his idea of an energetic government, other people shared. Certainly Washington shared that idea, partly from his experience of trying to get money for his army from organizations that did not have the power to tax. But I think that, and I think you're right, that he saw commerce as a binding force for the nation. Above anything else, he really strikes me as a nation builder. That's his, of all the men at the Constitutional Convention, most of them were there to solve immediate crises. Hamilton's a real visionary. Hamilton's in fact, in 1782, before we had even won the war, he's mapping out what the government would need to look like and what the people of America would need to do in order to have a seat at the table with European powers. And very soon after Washington is inaugurated, Hamilton is talking to an ambassador from Great Britain and basically says, "We're not important now, but you just hold on. We're gonna be as good as you really soon." And that's Hamilton's overriding goal. And the reason I shocked my colleagues by saying, I don't think he cared as much about the actual frame of the government. Madison was obsessed with the frame of the government. Hamilton thought of that frame as a kind of scaffolding. He thought, this is sort of the shape, but there's no meat around the bones yet. And the meat around the bones were going to be policy and programs. And Hamilton wanted to be the person who set the policy and set the programs in the areas that he thought were really important. And I think at the convention, when he realized that his largest goal, which was the power to tax and the power to regulate commerce, were going to be a reality of that government, that he was raring to go. that was what mattered the most to him. I'm not trying to describe him as anti-intellectual, far from that, but he had his eye on what he wanted. And those were the two elements that he needed in order to make America great. Not even again.
On a nonpartisan basis. Tony, both of your colleagues have said he wasn't that interested in the details of constitutional structure, and yet he made certain proposals at the convention that earned him the accusation of being a secret monarchist. He favored a president elected for life. He wanted a really insulated Senate. And then, of course, he was a co-author of the Federalist Papers, the leading defense of the Constitution. So what can you tell us about the details of his constitutional proposals that made people think that he was a monarchist?
All right, so Hamilton, by the way, I'm not going to wrap my answers. I just want to...
You can.
Okay.
Please do. This is the room where it happened.
That's right.
Yes.
You know, Hamilton goes to the convention, and I think it's very important to note that he's outvoted. So he goes with two other delegates from New York, and they were purposefully chosen by Clinton and his allies in the New York legislature to foil Hamilton's designs. And so he faces off against two anti-federalists, Yates and Lansing, and he's effectively outvoted. And I think Hamilton becomes extremely frustrated by that, and so I think he's chomping at the bit to get involved and to be more involved than what we were saying, but he's frustrated and he can't do it. But he has this proposal on June 18th. The Virginia plan has been proposed. The New Jersey plan has also, just a few days before that, been proposed. The Constitutional Convention, the delegates are at a loggerheads. They're stuck. They can't get past this debate. And Hamilton gives a 6-hour speech, which just leaves the delegates just speechless, literally speechless. No pun intended, but literally they just all file out, and they're just somewhat shocked by his proposal of a president for life, of a Senate for life. Now, he did have a more democratic House. And a lot of historians, which is something that I argue and I agree with, believe that Hamilton was trying to moderate the Virginia plan in the eyes of the delegates to make it more palatable and swing them away from the New Jersey plan. We don't really have much evidence for that, but because Hamilton is just so strategically brilliant, it's very possible, and I think probable, that he did that. But then, as Carol says, he effectively goes home. Now, other delegates left for periods of time and so forth, but eventually his fellow two delegates left, and New York didn't have a quorum, and so he didn't have a vote. And he's frustrated, comes back a few times, but doesn't have the influence over the at the Constitutional Convention that Madison and others had. But he's very instrumental, of course, in ratification, both as the author of a majority of the Federalist Papers and his sort of Herculean effort at the New York Ratifying Convention, where he was, there were 48 anti-Federalists, only 16 Federalists, and yet eventually he, along with John Jay and some others, but I credit Hamilton with really winning ratification in New York by 3 votes. So it's a pretty incredible effort after the delegates leave Philadelphia to get this thing ratified. He didn't have much influence maybe over its creation, but he and Madison were just wrecking crews. I mean, and just got that thing ratified.
Can I add something?
Sure.
People, anti-Hamilton people in most cases, will say, well, he was a monarchist and he won. But if you look at many of the men at that convention, his views were not so outside the norm as we might think. Madison, after all, one of the reasons he wanted the convention so bad is he said, I'm looking at the Virginia legislature and they're venal and they're corrupt and there's a lot, this is not what a republic should be like. We have to have a more elevated discussion. We have to have men who are more elevated who will be able to guide the republic. And Adams, when he and Jefferson have Adams is in England and Jefferson's in France, and when they get a copy of the Constitution, Jefferson expresses his horror that the president he wanted the presidency to rotate every year until, of course, he became president. Then it was really okay, 8 years was fine. And he wanted more frequent elections. And Adams writes back and he says, I'm paraphrasing, are you crazy? The more often you have elections, the more likely it is that something terrible is going to happen. We should have fewer elections. We shouldn't have more elections. And so if you put Hamilton's argument for a president for life on a continuum, it's not as if everybody else was marching this way and Hamilton was marching that way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a Republican speech, and so not only do I think it's strategic, this June 18th speech, but I think he meant every word of it. I think he sincerely believed in it, and it was Republican. And if you look at his political philosophy, I would argue that, you know, Hamilton supports Republican government very early on, and Farmer refuted. He fights for that government. He believes sincerely in Republican principles. And very much so during the 1790s. I mean, he's trying to promote economic prosperity for all Americans, not just the wealthy, and promotes a constitutional rule of law, a strong national security, promotes a strong union, as Jay said, for all Americans. I mean, he dedicates his entire life to public service for the Republic. Whatever Jefferson's accusations are, he's not a monarchist.
Great. So we have this vision of Hamilton as a devotee of Republican principles. And Jay, I now want you to contrast Hamilton's Republicanism with that of his most influential rival, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson more devoted to direct democracy than indirect representation of republicanism. Jefferson championing states' rights, Hamilton national power, Jefferson liberty, Hamilton economic prosperity. We say in the exhibit that all of American history can be described as a battle between Hamiltonian nationalism and Jeffersonian localism. That's, speaking in very broad terms, give us a nuanced sense of the clash between the philosophies of Jefferson and Hamilton.
Well, democracy, when the United States overthrew Great Britain, by declaration in 1776 and finally in effect at the Battle of Yorktown, what the country had done was set upon a democratic experiment, the likes of which, outside of a handful of city-states in northern Italy, the world hadn't seen in millennia. And it didn't go well. It was not a good experience. On the one hand, you have the Articles of Confederation, which were purposefully stripped of real power by states' rights delegates. And you also have these state governments, which are, by the standards of the age, would have been pristinely democratic. And in places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, in some states like Connecticut, not as much, but you have a real kind of participatory democracy happening. Now, by the standards of the contemporary age, I mean, it's important to recognize that we're talking about, this is not even universal white male suffrage. But looked at from, if you compare 1787 to today, it doesn't look very democratic. But if you compare 1787 to the last 1,000 or so years, it's impressively so. And it did not go well. And there was a sense that, when the founders and sort of men of education and reason and property would look at the situation, they would think back in many respects to the ancients and their almost tragic view of history. That the ancients didn't see life as we see it, like almost a kind of Star Trek kind of, we're always going forward and getting better and doing more and more. They saw this sort of perpetual cycle of rise, threshold, and then decline, so that democracy, or rule by the people, is an inherently weak institution and that it collapses into mob rule. And this is a theoretical idea that gets, the ancients sort of spell it out. It gets pulled forward in Machiavelli and ported through James Harrington into the American context. And it was more than just a bunch of dusty old books. It really looked like it was happening. Like if you look at, for instance, the behavior of the state of Rhode Island and their creditor-debtor laws, or if you look at New York State and the Clinton machine slapping an impost on imports coming into the port of New York that New Jersey and Connecticut had to pay with. I mean, it really looked as though democracy was in the process of failing. And so the challenge that the framers had, and this is a challenge that they all confronted, and they all had their own solutions, right? But to paraphrase Madison in a speech that he made on June 6th, right, that because America had already crossed the Rubicon in overthrowing George III, right? The classical solution to the problem of excess of democracy was to have some sort of hereditary estate, right? So this is why Montesquieu, for instance, celebrates the British system, because it takes a popularly elected House of Commons, balances it with the monarch and the House of Lords, and so all the different social factions are checked against one another. America had already thrown out that solution, and then, so as Madison aptly put it, what we need is a solution that solves the inconveniences of democracy while remaining consistent with the democratic form of government. And Hamilton's solution, which he offers on June 18th, is really to sort of reduce the role of popular opinion in the affairs of state by insulating the president and the Senate, but still anchoring them in popular control, because ultimately there were no hereditary estates in the Hamiltonian schema, right? Ultimately, you'd have the president separated by 2 electoral colleges and the Senate separated by 1. So in the end, they're still anchored on public opinion, but the idea is that this would allow the natural aristocracy to sort of rise through the ranks of the political hierarchy, and to be able to make judgments about policy and foreign affairs that are consistent with the true interests of the country, in juxtaposed to the small-mindedness that you see in state legislatures. Now, Jefferson, I would say, has a different view, where he has more faith in the capacity of average people to govern themselves under certain circumstances. And then I think that you could classify Jefferson's vision of government as being a series of concentric circles going outward. So on the local level, Jefferson sees, and he wasn't a libertarian, so on the local level, he would see control over things like education and even morals and things like that. The state level, you would have control over roads and things of that nature, and the national level being primarily concerned with issues of foreign affairs. But it reflects sort of Jefferson's greater faith in the capacity of individuals under certain circumstances to govern themselves relative to Hamilton's. So that I would say that that's probably a main difference. The commonality that really links all of these men together that we're going to discuss is, as I said, and as Madison said, is how do we solve the inconveniences of democracy while remaining consistent with the democratic form of government?
Absolutely fascinating. Carol, how much of a direct Democrat was Jefferson? Did he support the direct expression of popular will, and contrast his vision with that of Hamilton?
I am a Hamiltonian as opposed to a Jeffersonian, so I have to try to be extremely fair. I thank you. Applause from. I think that Jefferson had an idealized vocabulary about the people, whoever he imagined they were. That he had, when the French Revolution turned to guillotining everyone right and left, Jefferson still believed, that the French Revolution ought to be supported, that really this was temporary, that it was important. I always think of, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? Thousands of people. That he was able to immediately pastel paint over a lot of things that a realist might, like Gouverneur Morris or Hamilton, who might say, you know, those people aren't following in our revolutionary tradition. Those people are evil people. I think Jefferson often talked in a different form. What strikes me in the 1790s about Jefferson, regardless of his sort of spoken ideology, is that he manipulated the common man. When he organized that Jeffersonian Republican Party, he targeted German immigrants, Irish immigrants. He understood exactly to go after people who hated Great Britain, the Irish, the French immigrants who might have come over. There is a kind of cunning to the way in which he mobilized the people that I think does not reflect a desire for expanded democracy so much as it reflects a desire for him to get elected. That is, he really thought the Federalists were followers of Great Britain, which to some extent certainly was true. Hamilton said, these are the people who we can trade with best, and this will fill our coffers, and this will make us more prosperous. Jefferson called them monocrats. He had fantasized conspiracies against the people. But what he's doing when he reaches out to these people is he's trying to build a political base. And so I'm a little hesitant to describe him in his actions as democratic so much as I am always to believe that the Jeffersonians understood the desire of the people to have a broader voice in government, and they knew how to play that.
Tony, Carol introduces this crucial clash between ideals and institutions and the problem of parties. In the exhibit, there's this phenomenal original letter where Jefferson says to his subordinates, go tear Hamilton to pieces, basically go set the press on him and destroy him. And they use their party-funded press from their jobs in the Washington administration to attack each other, and the Federalists and Democratic Republicans go after each other. Henry Adams praised Jefferson for betraying his principles as president and having supported limited national power, broadening the scope of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase more than any other president. And Hamilton, too, flipped on some cases. So can you say more about the degree to which Hamilton and Jefferson, as party politicians, betrayed their own purported nationalism versus states' rights localism?
Well, certainly in the 1790s, this conflict arises to some degree over the report on public credit and certainly over the bank. The two have extremely different constitutional interpretations of whether a bank is constitutional. I believe that, of course, I'm on my second book on Hamilton now, so I'm going to take Hamilton's side. But you know, he hasn't. You know, Hamilton though, he looks at the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, and he says, look, you know, the bank is related to these foregoing powers, and you know, it seems to be, it's an expansive reading, but it's a legitimate reading of this Constitution. And don't forget, he was at the Constitutional Convention, and Jefferson's in Paris drinking French wines and having crazy philosophical explorations about, you know, about various topics, about, you know, property rights only lasting 19 years. And
noticing Sally Hemings.
Well, there is that, and supporting this violent revolution. And so Jefferson has an extremely restrictive view of this clause. And he says, is it absolutely necessary? Is it absolutely proper? Almost to the extent that nothing, this federal government, which is supposed to be empowered to accomplish certain objects, as Hamilton says, it needs the means to achieve its ends. Jefferson doesn't believe that. He takes an extremely literal reading of it and opposes the bank. But Hamilton wins that contest pretty easily. And after that, Jefferson and Hamilton are just at loggerheads. They just, the clashes there and the accusations of monarchism, you know, throughout the bank war, with the dispute over the Whiskey Rebellion, foreign policy, whether we should support the French or the British. Hamilton believes in an expansive vision, an expansive national security state, supporting the British, but promoting the economic development of America. And Jefferson is going to oppose him every step of the way, from within the administration, right? And even supporting an anti-administration newspaper within the State Department. So it's very duplicitous.
And yet these two great rivals respect each other enough so that, and again in the exhibition, there's a bust of Jefferson, a bust of Hamilton, and Jefferson had it at Monticello. He respected his rivals so much that he inspired himself by looking at the bust until the day he died. Jay, we've got two more founders to move through. You can say more about Jefferson. We've got to get through Madison, and we can't leave poor Adams out as we did on the podcast. Right. Plus, there are these great audience questions, so I want you to set up the contrast between Hamilton and Madison, maybe by talking about their conflict over the bank. Yeah. Hamilton insisted that it was justified by what he called the sweeping clause. That's the necessary and proper clause that Tony just mentioned. Madison, who initially opposed it, came to believe that the acquisition of the President and Congress and its constitutionality justified it, and yet the two men divided. So what were the main clashes between Hamilton and Madison?
Right. Well, I would say, first of all, that the fight over the Bank of the United States reflected the ambiguous nature of the Constitution as a piece of law. That if you were to take a common law interpretation of the Constitution, you would probably conclude, as Hamilton did, that the bank follows from as a proper articulation of the various enumerated powers. However, if you, on the other hand, were to take the Constitution as a statement of Republican sentiment throughout the country, you probably would need to know that several states that had ratified the Constitution, including Massachusetts, which was really the first test that the Constitution faced. The first 5 states, 4 of the first 5 were all small states that benefited from a stronger national union. The Pennsylvania Federalists more or less just crammed it down the throat of the Anti-Federalists. Massachusetts was the first state where there was a genuine struggle over the Constitution, and the solution that they came up with was the idea of ratification under the good faith expectation for amendments. Now, and this is how, of course, we get what became known as the Bill of Rights. But importantly, several states, among them Massachusetts, have a recommended amendment prohibiting Congress from chartering corporations and granting them exclusive rights. So the question then becomes, from a Republican standpoint, well, if states like Massachusetts, and importantly Virginia, where the margin was only 10 votes, if Patrick Henry could look into the future and see that a Bank of the United States was going to be chartered and communicate that to the delegates at the Virginia ratifying convention, would he have been able to swing 5 votes from Madison's side to his own side? So there's a theoretical tension there that's also amplified by the fact that constitutional hermeneutics, the interpretation of the Constitution, has almost always been, when it's done by politicians, disingenuous. Mm-hmm. And I would, as an example of that, I would point to Madison in particular. Madison was the one who sort of made the point of saying, even late in life, he said, Colonel Hamilton wanted to interpret the Constitution as he saw fit, but I wanted to interpret it the way the convention, and more important, the ratifications saw it. Okay, fine. But Madison was also the editor of the Bill of Rights, and he strategically narrowed the scope of actual amendments consistent with his own point of view. Jefferson also was disingenuous or strategic or whatever you want to call it about constitutional authority because, of course, the Louisiana Purchase. And John Quincy Adams later commented, and I think he has a point, that it was a power grab that was greater in scope and implication than anything done under the first 12 years of the Republic. And I think that the framework to look at the bank battle is, I mean, the constitutional arguments are interesting, but the bank issue has to be examined in the context of the assumption battle from the previous summer, and this growing sense among the partisans of what would become the Republican Party of Jefferson and Madison, that something profoundly unfair was unfolding before their eyes in the government in New York. And that is to say that well-connected speculators, particularly in the eastern seaboards, in eastern cities of Boston, especially New York and Philadelphia, had caught wind of Hamilton's program before it was actually announced. Now, Hamilton was not actively tipping people off. As a matter of fact, Light Horse Harry Lee had asked him in December of 1789, hey, you got any tips? And Hamilton told him to go pound sand in so many words. But Hamilton had a bad habit of choosing lousy characters to surround himself with. So in particular, he hires William Duer to be the first Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, while Duer is simultaneously trying to set up an international banking syndicate. And the point is that word gets out. And why does this matter? It matters because state and federal debt certificates during the 1790s were trading for pennies on the dollar because people did not expect the governments, the federal government or the state governments, to ever actually pay these back. So if you were somebody who happened to have money in the 1780s, in say December of 1789 or November of 1789, and you get word that Hamilton is going to offer a full repayment of the national debt, you can go off to people who are not in the know and buy the debt on pennies on the dollar. And this is, in fact, what happened. And moreover, what you can do is you can start going to, say, the Dutch, which is exactly what Gouverneur Morris does. Gouverneur Morris heads off to France, and then he goes to the Dutch and tells the creditors in the Netherlands, hey, you might want to buy domestic debt certificates from me because I have it on good authority that the debt is going to be paid back in full. And then after that is passed, Hamilton's bank proposal offers you can for just $25 in hard cash, you could get a bank scrip. The rest of it was payable in government debt certificates. So in a very short period of time, from between 1787 to 1791, debt certificates are being repaid at really just pennies on the dollar, and then they turn around and you can use them to purchase what is in effect a guaranteed moneymaker, and in the chartering and the operation of the Bank of the United States leads to the first genuine Wall Street panic because the price of the banknotes just goes crazy and there's a big bubble and it bursts. Jefferson and Madison in particular was very aware of this, and he was also very aware of how this was detrimental to people who were not in and around the seat of government, which is why at the end of the day the Assumption Plan included situating the capital on the Potomac River. They're very sensitive to the fact that news traveled slowly and that Congress had actually suspended debate on the Assumption Plan when it was announced, so members of Congress could send people down to the hinterlands of the Carolinas and buy up bank scrip. And this is also why they were suspicious that Hamilton was trying to formulate a monarchy, because this is the sort of thing that the British monarch did after the Glorious Revolution. He could use what was called the civil list to basically buy off members of Parliament. They believed that Hamilton was employing a similar system with his economic package. And I think that really speaks to, if we put aside the hyperbole of the age, there is at the heart of the battle between Jefferson and Madison on the one hand and Hamilton on the other hand, this tension between we need to build a prosperous, strong, secure nation, which was Hamilton's main goal, and Jefferson and Madison's anxiety that there was something profoundly unfair going on, that this was, to borrow a phrase, trickle-down economics, that the rich were getting richer, and that the rich happened to be friends and, in Madison and Hamilton's view, Madison and Jefferson's view, cronies of Alexander Hamilton and Rufus King and Gouverneur Morris and so on, and William Duer especially.
But it was a certain kind of rich. I mean, if you take away a lot of the overview, what's going on is that Hamilton's program is setting the trajectory of the nation economic trajectory or political economy of the nation toward commerce, trade, which is largely located in the Northeast. Jefferson and Madison are from where? From Virginia. And when Hamilton's plan comes out, Madison, who had been his partner, his comrade in arms, through all the plans to get the Constitutional Convention called, through the convention, with the Bill of Rights, all of a sudden Madison is Hamilton's enemy. And it has a lot to do, there were rich people in Virginia, there were rich people in South Carolina, but their wealth was based on agriculture. And I think he sees very clearly, Madison sees very clearly, that the direction of Hamilton's program is toward everything that favors the urban North, or the cities of the North, the people of the North, who are engaged in commerce and trade, and that this is something that threatens the position. Virginia was the richest and most prosperous and most populous state in the beginning. And the vision that they will become less significant, the Old Dominion will not be the leading light of the 13 states, is really extremely painful to Jefferson and Madison. When Adams goes to negotiate the peace treaty, the one thing that he is stubbornly wedded to is fishing rights off Newfoundland. Why? Because the fishing industry, this is not for, fly fishing for fun, because the fishing industry was a big industry. And it was supported by the lumbering industry and by the shipbuilding industry, that this was at the heart of it. And this kind of activity was not what Virginia planters were engaged in. They were engaged in buying up land in the West and selling it to small farmers who wanted to buy it, which is one reason why the Louisiana Purchase was such a lovely idea. And so I think we have to think of regional self-interest in both cases as much as we can think about political theory.
Tony, we must put Adams on the table before we get to the great audience questions. And in the exhibit, there is a powerful split between Adams and Hamilton, both great Federalists, but Hamilton starts attacking Adams in a fit of pique, and Adams writes an unpublished defense, which he wants to publish after Hamilton's death, methodically making the case for his own administration against Hamilton's importunation. So why did Hamilton break with Adams, and what was the clash over the Constitution?
Well, the interesting and even strange thing is that there's this huge debate among Federalists, and Adams and Hamilton largely agree on policy. They, particularly during Adams' presidency, and he is supporting peace through strength and negotiations during this crisis, this quasi-war with France, in which France was seizing our ships and violating our neutral rights. Hamilton agrees with them on the policy. He also wants peace through strength, but they had engaged in the politics of personal destruction. And it became very personal. And Adams almost obsessively believed that Hamilton kept trying to keep him out of the office and kept manipulating the elections and engineering other Federalists to win, both in 1796 and in 1800. And then Hamilton sends this letter, this not very complimentary letter about Adams, which then gets published. And so Adams goes ballistic and becomes even more angry with Hamilton. And so there's this personal rage that matched, I think, the antipathy that Jefferson and Hamilton had in the early 1790s. And yet the funny thing is they're in the same party and they agree. So maybe it's not unlike, you know, today's Tea Partiers and John Boehner trying to reign in Congress and so forth, and Rand Paul fighting against him and so forth. So there was a lot of tension within the party, and of course, within only a few years, it'll collapse.
So that's a powerful statement of the fact that much of it was personal.
Yep.
But Jay, your book, your forthcoming book, is The Price of Greatness, Hamilton, Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy.
Right.
Both Madison and Jefferson were centrally concerned with oligarchy ruled by the moneyed few. Both Jefferson supported that constitutional amendment you mentioned that would have forbidden Congress from setting up corporations with exclusive privileges. Madison is looking forward to 1930 and worrying that income inequality is going to be too great to sustain Republican principles. Was Hamilton more of a supporter of oligarchy, and did that distinguish him from Adams, who was also concerned about oligarchy and rule by the few?
Yeah, I think that they would have had slightly different views. I think that Hamilton saw himself as sort of a Robert Walpole, the sort of a British Prime Minister. That I think that he felt that he could channel the interests of the moneyed elite toward the national welfare. That this was almost sort of, he could tame the tiger, in other words. And I think that, you know, he had expressed affection for one reason he had, his sort of affection for the British system of government is very reminiscent of the essays of David Hume, who was also a defender of the way the crown, the British monarchy, sort of manipulated Parliament, which was very principled sort of. It gets twisted in the Jeffersonian party rhetoric into, you know, Hamilton wants, Jefferson called it not just a monarchy, but a monarchy bottomed on corruption. But if you actually, you read David Hume and you see, oh, well, this is where Hamilton's coming from, that there's sort of a natural aristocracy that can sort of take the self-interested impulses of the moneyed elite and turn them toward the public good. Adams, I think, has first, I think it's important to recognize, too, that Adams and Hamilton, even though they're in the same party and they're both from the North, they come from very different backgrounds. Massachusetts is, you know, relatively, you know, town-based economy, small freeholding. Hamilton, he's not born into it, but he sort of marries into this sort of wealthy, commercial, landed, you know, Dutch kind of universe in New York with the Schuyler's and the Van Rensselaers and, you know, Gouverneur Morris and intermarriage and things like that. So they have sort of different views. And Adams, unfortunately for him, was misunderstood. As if he was here, he would certainly tell us that he has been profoundly misunderstood.
Right.
And then I think the better view of sort of Adams's role, view on the moneyed interest, is that Adams probably, if he had been at the convention, would have supported, you know, apportionment in the upper house based on wealth. But not because he thought that the wealthy were more virtuous, which is something that a view that Hamilton could slip into, but that Adams was worried about the moneyed interests spreading their control throughout the entirety of the government, and that if they had a branch of the government that was their own, they could be contained there. So Adams has a more classical sort of view of mixed estates, I think, that is similar in some respects to Hamilton's, but Hamilton's is also really intermingled with his own view of himself and his own sort of ambitions, and it's sort of mixed up in this idea of, you know, a class of leaders taking whatever instrumentation of government exists and sort of making it work toward the public good. And that's really distinguishes Hamilton in a lot of respects.
Great. Carol, last word before we go to these great audience questions. So interesting to hear so many of the founders concerned about oligarchy ruled by the moneyed few, taking their move from Montesquieu, who contrasts democracy ruled by the many, aristocracy by the few, and monarchy by the single potentate, which can degenerate into the mob in the case of democracy, oligarchy in the case of aristocracy and tyranny in the case of monarchy. So tell us more about Adams's concern about oligarchy, which he shared with Madison and Jefferson, and how all of the framers were really concerned about ruled by moneyed elites.
I always see Adams's hatred of Hamilton to have very little to do with policy. He hated Hamilton because he thought that the people in his party turned to Hamilton to lead them. Adams, who I really love, but who was such a terrible president, Adams keeps men in his cabinet who are left over from George Washington's cabinet, instead of building around him a group of men who supported him. And most of them turned to Hamilton to ask, what should we do? What should we do? They pretty much ignore Adams. And Adams is so sensitive to his own standing, to being not appreciated, to being early on in his life, when he's friends with Jonathan Sewell, he's constantly saying, I'm just a lowly worm. No one will ever remember me. I'll never be famous. Nothing. And even during his role in the Revolution and diplomacy, he was saying, they'll only remember Benjamin Franklin. They won't remember me. And it tears him apart that his cabinet views him as sort of, well, that's nice. Now let us go ask Alexander Hamilton what we ought to do. This is not Hamilton's fault, but Hamilton certainly enjoys that. And he wants Adams to do what Hamilton thinks is best. He wants to play the same role in many ways that he played with Washington, which is prime minister for the new president, and he gets very angry when he can't do that. Plus, he wanted to be the general of the army that Adams put together when they thought France was going to attack them. And Adams desperately tries to prevent this from happening. He does not want Hamilton to have another honor. He doesn't want Hamilton to be the head. And it's only Washington's intervention. Washington is nominally head of this huge army that they put together. But he says, I want my second in command, who will really run the thing, to be Alexander Hamilton. And that's the final straw for Adams. This is a very personal conflict from Adams's point of view. And toward the very end of his administration, he sits down and he says, I'm president. I'm going to make the decisions. I'm not going to let people push me around anymore. And it's a little too late.
Hamilton really was, I think it's important to bear in mind, just on a personality level, that Hamilton really was a force of nature. Right?
Yeah.
That Jefferson writes Madison during the debate of the Jay Treaty. Hamilton ends up writing something like 30-odd essays in favor of the Jay Treaty, just this endless torrent of words streaming forth.
In about 12 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing.
And so Hamilton was a problem for these guys in a lot of respects. I mean, it's one thing when you're on the same side with him during Madison and Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention or writing the Federalists, but when you get on opposite sides of the spectrum on a political divide, Jefferson wrote to Madison and said, he is the colossus of the federal party. Without numbers, right? They don't have numbers. Jefferson and Madison believed they didn't have the numbers, but they had Hamilton. And Jefferson says he's a host unto himself. And what Adams's political problems, and it gets to this sort of ambiguity in the early government where they switch the Constitution on, and we don't really know how it's going to work. So, who's the leader of this political coalition? Is it Adams by virtue of being the president and Washington's successor, or is it Hamilton by virtue of being Hamilton, right? That's sort of the way Hamilton, and it's hard at times to appreciate that now because he's not alive anymore. But he was really bursting at the seams with passion and vigor and energy. He was full to bursting.
He was called by women because he was very attractive. Women called him Little Adonis, but men called him Little Mars.
Yeah, you definitely don't want that. Well, we've done our duty, friends, of contrasting Hamilton's constitutional vision with that of Adams, Madison, and Jefferson, and now the audience wants more of this theme that you've introduced here, which is what sort of person was he? And our first questioner asks, tell us more about his temper, and also why did he admit his affair? We have the originals of the letter in which he admitted the affair, and also the originals of the letter in which the fatal duel was set up. And it's so cool in the exhibit downstairs. We've paced out the duel, and you can stand at either side and see how close they were to each other when they stood. It's really remarkable to realize how intimate it was. But Tony, tell us more about his temper and why he admitted the affair.
You know, I think that Jay got him correct a few minutes ago. He's a man of just energy that's just bursting forth. I mean, he's elected Secretary of the Treasury on a Friday. He's already in the office all weekend, securing loans and so forth, and hitting the ground running on Monday. You know, when he is solicited by Congress or by Washington to write opinions or reports and so forth, why write 4,000 words when you can write 24,000 words? You know, it's just, he's just bursting with energy, and he's the smartest guy in the room, contrary to what Kennedy said about Jefferson dining alone. He's the smartest man in the room, but unfortunately he lets everybody know it, right? There's a because there's such genius there, there's also just a touch of, or maybe more than a touch of arrogance. There's not a lot of humility, but you know, he's a young, he dies relatively young, right? I think I've outlived him now that my 40th birthday was yesterday. I think I've outlived him. But he's a young man on the make throughout all this public service, a young man on the make, and he just wants to win immortal fame. He wants to be the guy in charge. He wants to be making policy, and he largely does. He's very successful.
Please do, but I want to get some more questions on the floor too at the same time. So I'm going to ask, if Hamilton had not been killed in the duel with Burr, how would history have been different, Carol?
Well, by the time they had that duel, Hamilton's day had passed. Jeffersonian Republicans had basically taken over. And Hamilton, at one point, he says, there's no place for me anymore in this country. It's very sad. I mean, he feels as if his time is over because of the triumph of the Jeffersonians. But I do want to say the reason he confessed to the affair was he wanted to defend himself against claims that he had been involved in inside trading.
Right.
That was more important to Hamilton, that his reputation as a political leader was pristine, whereas his reputation as a man, a married man, could be sacrificed for that. That probably tells you a lot about Hamilton.
And there's a reason why, right? He was constantly investigated by Congress, by the Republicans in Congress in the 1790s because of perceived improprieties in office. And you want to talk about dotting every I and crossing every T. I mean, these reports he would do to defend himself were meticulous, and they never proved any public official wrongdoing. And the thing is that, you know, as I argue in my new book on Hamilton, he's constantly, that's right. Thank you for the plug.
Not at all. I wish I had all of your books to show.
But consistently sought to defend not only his personal honor, but his public honor as well, which is why he relates this just detail or just this salacious, all the salacious facts of the affair.
And then he goes and buys his wife a new house. He reminds me, I always told my students, it's like Kobe Bryant bought that great big ring when he cheated on his wife. That's the Grange. That's the Grange.
Jay, you can jump in, but this question is very much for you as well. Would Hamilton be a anti-Trump Republican today, a Rockefeller Republican, or a Democrat?
He'd probably be he would be a Hamiltonian.
Yeah.
Is what
Well, then I'll ask the question you've asked, which is, are the Democrats today more Hamiltonian
it's
than
hard
the
to
Republicans?
say. I mean, he was he was his own ideology, and certain strands of it get pulled forward in a time. Emphasis on commerce and finance get pulled forward, but other things, the emphasis on, aristocratic control or minimizing democratic involvement, that doesn't. So and that's the case with all of them.
Right.
I think, and I would just add, sort of to piggyback off the conversation too, that about Hamilton's personality, is that he at times could display a shocking level of naivete.
Yes.
Alexander Hamilton never made a dime off of his economic program. And this is what Jefferson and William Branch Giles and Madison and Monroe, they were all convinced that Hamilton was lining his own pockets. Okay, he wasn't. But Hamilton had this group of people encircling him: William Duer, Andrew Craigie, William McCone, Robert Morris, Gouverneur Morris, Rufus King, who were all getting rich off of it. Hamilton himself never made a dime. And this is sort of the way, in his June 18th speech, in a lot of respects, where he goes and basically calls for a monarchy without, hereditary titles, I think in a lot of respects reflects a real naivete. Other things, his confession of the Reynolds affair, shockingly naive. His public denunciation of John Adams in the run-up to the presidential selection of 1800, and his harebrained scheme to split the vote so he could sneak Pinckney into the presidential office in 1800. I mean, Hamilton really oftentimes just played the fool. And so for as brilliant as he was, it's interesting to juxtapose him and Madison in that regard, that Madison did not have Hamilton's dashing countenance or his sort of historical flair and his daring do. But, Hamilton was just absolutely blindsided in the spring of 1790 when Madison decided to turn on him and really made his life miserable, because that was a skill set that was within Madison's ambit. And Hamilton really couldn't see it coming.
Go ahead.
It's also true that he was naive with women. This Maria Reynolds, whose husband pimped her to Hamilton, would write to him for years. As I lie here in my bed with my hair flowing over my bosom, I think of you, Mr. Hamilton. Please send $10. And he sent it. I mean, when Peggy Arnold did her routine, I didn't know my husband was going to do this. I'm so stupid. What will happen to me? Hamilton races to her bedside and says, "Don't worry, madam, we will protect you." And Washington's going, "Oh, for God's sake." I mean, he was extremely naive. There were pockets of naivete in him that, in many ways really makes him a little more adorable, but it runs through him pretty.
There's a chance. There is circumstantial evidence to suggest that James Reynolds, who was Maria's husband, he was a fraudster. He was a crook.
Right.
And there is real evidence to suggest that James Reynolds was working with William Duer, who at the time was at the Treasury Board of the federal government, to basically defraud soldiers in Virginia. William Duer, whom Hamilton made the first Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and who used it as an opportunity, like I said, to set up tried unsuccessfully to set up an international banking syndicate, basically using his public powers. I mean, Hamilton just had a terrible time reading people. He got played by Dewar, and he got really badly was played by William Dewar, and really badly played by Maria and James Reynolds.
Yeah.
Really shockingly.
But you know, one thing we are, you know, a lot of these examples are from the later 1790s. Not all of them that the two of you mentioned, but what Steve Knott and I argue in our book on Washington and Hamilton is that, you know, he had such a close alliance for so many decades with Washington, and Washington was a good judge of character,
Yes.
and was moderate and more deliberate and so forth, less easily fooled. And once he loses Washington as an ally, when he finally retires from the presidency, I think a lot of these political, very public mistakes
point.
come to the fore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We have time for one last question in this completely fascinating debate, and it's a great one for the National Constitution Center. In light of the great polarization in America today, are there lessons to be learned from the battles between Hamilton and Jefferson? Did they anticipate our current polarized politics, or can they shed light on the possibility and effectiveness of compromise today?
You know, I'd like to address that because it's something I've thought about a lot, you know. I think that the wonderful thing, although they engaged in the politics of personal destruction, and they were probably way more partisan and way better at insulting each other than we ever will be. And their, you know, their debates, their attacks on each other were extremely public and very biting and nasty. I'll say this, though, that the debates we've been talking about, the wonderful thing about it here at the National Constitution Center is to think about it's a debate that was very much influenced by the Constitution. It wasn't personal preference. It wasn't just what they thought might be good for the country or so forth. It was deeply rooted in their understanding of the Constitution. Now, they had different understandings of the Constitution, but it was an extremely constitutional argument. And that's what I love about the bank argument. It's constitutional. In other words, they took the Constitution seriously. And I think we all wish that our statesmen, our politicians would do a little bit more of that today.
Beautiful. I must end with that gorgeous note. Ladies and gentlemen, it is inspiring to see that this was a constitutional battle of ideas, and all of us have a duty and obligation to educate ourselves about these competing constitutional visions that define the early debates, and to be inspired by the fact that they were clashes of principle rather than purely of personality, all united by a common devotion to this great document of human freedom, the U.S. Constitution. Go see the exhibit, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.